I won't talk for very long, but I just want to make a few main points about parking, which, by the way, I see as part of the broader transport and land use system. It's not an isolated issue. So I was fortunate in that a number of years ago, with a group of colleagues, we won this big grant from the Australian Research Council, and that allowed us to conduct a lot of research on parking. We focused on three Australian big cities along the East Coast, so Brisbane, where I live, as well as Sydney and Melbourne, which count as mega cities. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of parking policy in these places was made in the dark. The places didn't know very much or weren't quite sure how much parking they actually had. It was just difficult, really difficult to estimate the amount of space that parking was taking up in these cities. So, anyways, this project led to a lot of publications, a lot of academic products, and I'll share a link to summary of those. We put together a simple website to summarize all the research outcomes. But one that I wanted to highlight is this book. Was published a few years ago. It's called Parking in International Perspective, same title as this webinar today. And it includes case studies from 12 different cities around the world, both global north and global south. And that's one of the things that we see with the book's content, that a lot of parking problems are shared around the world, regardless of level of economic development. So that was interesting. And we wrote the conclusion to set forth a parking research agenda for the future, which I'll talk about later on. But we were also honored to have the introduction of the book written by Donald Shoup, who is, of course, the grandfather or godfather of parking research. And I was fortunate to take his class at UCLA years ago. That's where my interest in parking first started. So that's that for the book. I've put a link down at the bottom if you'd like to order it or recommend it to your library. But anyways, I'll talk briefly about some of the parking policies that are covered in the book. There is a lot around on-street parking reforms, and that's no wonder, because personally, I see on-street parking as a form of blight in cities. I mean, wherever we have street spaces that are dominated by parking, you can't expect any sort of good urban design, any urban design quality. So no wonder a lot of cities now are grappling with on-street parking issues, trying to figure out ways to make it, well, both more efficient, but also more visually appealing. And to make it visually appealing, oftentimes you just should not be there. You need to hide it out of sight. And then when it comes to off-street parking reforms, the main innovation in this space has been to establish maximum parking limits or caps, parking caps, as opposed to minimum parking requirements as it was done in the past. So the traditional paradigm in parking, as in road construction, infrastructure provision generally, has been predict and provide. So trying to figure out how much parking was going to be needed for each land use at the peak. So a supermarket, how many go to the supermarket, but at the very peak, for example, the day before Christmas, where when everyone's doing their Christmas shopping, and provide enough parking to meet that demand. And that meant, of course, those parking spaces could be empty the rest of the time. And this is sort of a well-known say in transport planning. It's been attributed to different people over the years, but trying to solve the parking problem or the road capacity problem by expanding provision. It's a little bit like trying to cure something like obesity by buying bigger pants, right? You can make it look better, but the underlying problem is still there. So this is what parking has done to our cities. We have vast spaces dedicated to surface lots. And as an urban designer, this bothers me quite a lot from an aesthetics perspective. I am very sensitive to urban aesthetics. I have this almost visceral reaction to ugly spaces. And parking lots are definitely one of the ugliest land uses we can have. But I mean, they're a disaster from environmental perspective as well. Look at all that asphalt. And here in Australia, we're just talking with Paula and Wendy before we started. It's a hot country. Most of our cities are pretty hot in the summer. So the more asphalt we had, the hotter we make them. And then along Along the streets is the same problem. Streets don't feel very pedestrian friendly. They're dominated by parked cars on both sides. But I mean, even off-street parking, it's not great. You know, it's a lot of carbon sunk to create an off-street high-rise parking lot like this. And let's not even talk about underground parking. That's very, very expensive to create, as in the underground parking that accompanies new residential towers, for example. And in addition to parking itself, so the parked cars, parking comes with all this paraphernalia, all these signs and symbols all around our cities, which just add to the blight. But so that said, that makes it sound a bit like all gloomy, doom and gloom. But I mean, there are things that are happening in our cities and societies and economies that promise to improve the parking situation. So a lot of cities are starting to apply these new policies around planning, land use planning, trying to consolidate land uses. And if you consolidate land uses, then the parking need is not as great because more people can use alternative transport. And then when it comes to economy and society, we are seeing some trends around younger people not wanting to drive as much as in past generations. Younger people are being now more interested in the urban versus the very suburban car-oriented lifestyle. And then we have the technology side, we have the promise of driverless cars. I know that they seem a bit like they're forever 5 years away. They've been 5 years away for the past 10, 15 years. But at some point they'll be coming. That technology will have repercussions in terms of parking. So I can't cover all of these trends in such a short presentation, but I will talk about a few that I'm most interested in. For example, the idea of TOD, transit-oriented development. I'm passionate about this concept. In fact, I did my whole postdoctoral research on TOD. So it's a simple idea. It's about condensing development around existing transit infrastructure, be that rail or high capacity bus lines like BRT. And the idea is to go beyond single node TOD to extend TOD to entire regions. So articulate regions based on access to transit. And then TOD can also apply to urban areas like this last picture here shows. And in urban areas, it takes more the form of corridors because transit stops are spaced much closer together in urban areas as opposed to the suburbs. So one thing to say about TOD is it's in direct conflict with another parking concept that's been popular, in Australia as well, elsewhere, called PNR, or Park and Ride. That implies that people from suburban areas with no transit access would use a car to reach a transit station, park there, and then go to work, say to a CBD or major employment center via transit, so they don't have to drive all the way. So that's a good idea. I mean, it looks like a good idea in theory, but the problem is, to accommodate this concept, one needs vast parking lots around transit stations. And the TOD concept says we should actually have high density development, as in residential and commercial and office, or possibly parks, like in this picture here that illustrates the concept on the left-hand side, possibly parkland, but not parking lots. So you can see these two are in conflict. And then we have the concept of driverless cars. I mean, a lot of people are very excited about the idea of not having to do any driving anymore. That includes myself. I don't drive, so that seems very promising. If I could just call a car and it takes me around without me having to do anything, without putting the effort to pay attention to the road. The problem is, though, that I mean, the current thinking is that with driverless cars, if we give them completely unchecked access to all of our urban spaces, there won't be much improvement in terms of congestion or even parking demand. So the most promising scenario for driverless cars does not look too different from TOD. So having driverless cars, instead of picking people door to door, having them pick up people at major stopping spots. So this is some simplification of urban space. So a regular sort of North American or Australian city laid out in a grid. So the idea is to have sort of major pickup hubs where there is more density, and then maybe smaller pickup hubs elsewhere. But as you can see, I mean, this is it bears very close resemblance to the TOD concept. So it's TOD, but with driverless cars as opposed to transit. So that's our best bet for the future, not to create a new parking problem with driverless cars. Okay, so like I said, overall, the future looks bright. There are many possibilities out there. We can make things better, but governments will need to exercise caution and control. If we apply sort of a laissez-faire mentality and just let our cities be run by driverless cars and development without any planning thought, then our parking problems will not go away. They might become worse even. Okay, so I mentioned earlier in the presentation how we created this agenda for parking research, because we saw there was a gap there. A lot of places don't have a very good idea of how much parking they have, let alone what they should do with it. So a main task is to identify the problems and compile a parking inventory. So then once a city knows how much parking it has available, then it needs to start deciding what it wants to do about it. Reduce it, regulate it a certain way. If there are new technologies coming, have a bit of a think about what those new technologies might do to parking, how they may help rather than hurt. And then whatever future transport and land use scenarios are developed, that's something that cities normally do, they need to include parking in the mix, account for parking spaces devoted to parking. I mean, it's like I said in the beginning, it's parking is part of the transport system, it's part of the land use system, so it needs to be considered by both groups of planners. And most importantly, any parking decisions need to be made based on evidence rather than ideology or simple pressure from communities, from vocal members of communities. Okay, and then I want to very briefly talk about this new idea, this concept we've coined with some colleagues at GQ, Robin Hood planning, we call it, which means taking space away from parking and giving it to active transport. So, where does this come from? Well, it comes simply from the realization that a lot of our cities are already built, right? If you create new neighborhoods or entirely new cities, then you can apply innovative concepts there. But in an already built city, the road space is what it is. You can't knock down buildings to expand roads to accommodate all types of users. And now we need more and more space to accommodate micromobility because, I mean, in the past, micromobility was just cycling and walking. Pedestrians were on the sidewalk, and then cyclists sometimes were given a little bit of space as in a bike lane, which sometimes was just a line on the concrete. But now we're seeing e-scooters and all manner of other micromobility modes. I mean, even e-skateboards. So if you do a really quick online search, there's just amazing designs, mono wheels and sort of body wheels where you're inside the wheel rather than riding the wheel. So all of these vehicles will need some sort of shared space on the road. I mean, you can't have a separate lane for each of them. Imagine how complicated the signals, the traffic signals will be if we did that. So what I've proposed here, I've done this very simple design in Street Mix, which is a very cool online tool to rearrange road space, road sections. So I've taken a standard suburban main street, 34-meter wide, and reorganized it where in the bottom you can see all the micromobility is accommodated in a very wide micromobility lane here on the left-hand side. And there is a dedicated lane for transit, and then there is no parking at all, or wherever there is parking, it's in the form of drop-off zones, because imagine with driverless cars, there isn't as much need for the car to be parked along the side of the road. The driverless car can just drop someone off and then go off and make another trip. So all you need is curb space to make that drop off. The car doesn't need to sit there. So no change in the buildings, no need to stretch the road. I've just reorganized the space. And these are not completely new ideas, right? If you look at some of the very, very early planning models, as in 19th century, early 20th century, if you look at the street sections for Paris, when they redesigned Paris, Baron Haussmann's big project in the 19th century, those plates did not include any on-street parking at all, actually, for the big Parisian boulevards that we all love now. So that's that for me. And let me know if you have questions, and let's discuss.
Thank you, Dorina. That was fantastic. And I always love that idea of Robin Hood planning. I think it should start in Nottingham and get that going. So thank you very much. So if you're interested in asking a question, please stick your hand up, and then you can do that. And if you want to ask your question on the chat, feel free to do so and I'll relay it. I do have one question from Daniel earlier on, who says, does the notion of on-street parking as a form of blight deserve any qualification based on how it functions in the context of regional, country-specific differences in urbanism and street design practices? I'm thinking in particular of the very wide streets typical of the US and Canada, and also Australia, I think, where on-street parking often serves a traffic calming function.
I mean, Daniel, I totally take your point. I mean, I can see what you mean there, but my reaction is there are better ways to do traffic calming. We could do traffic calming by creating green hedges rather than parking, right? So we create new urban design forms. We can have temporary commercial structures, and those would serve that same traffic calming function. I mean, this reminds me of some discussions we used to have in my home country. I'm from Albania originally. Albania emerged from communism in 1990, very poor, and the revolution itself created more destruction. Things got worse before they got better throughout the 90s. And so urban roads were in very bad condition. And a lot of people were saying we can't even drive cars or even ride bicycles for that matter with the urban roads filled with potholes. And then you'd hear from time to time, you'd hear voices in society saying, yes, but at least these roads in bad condition, they perform a traffic calming function. And that's true in a sense. It was hard to drive on those roads. So some people simply don't drive because the roads were in poor condition. But I mean, it's hard to argue that that's a good solution to urban design, right? So I see the same thing applying to parking nowadays.
Sure, yeah.
Okay,
So,
so
oh,
sorry, I didn't hear. I couldn't see anybody put a hand up. Sorry about
oh,
that.
sorry.
Ali, you go.
I'm sorry, I missed the hand function. But yeah, I wanted to. Hi, I'm Alicia. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the Robin Hood parking. I think there was some excitement in the chat, just more specifically around, are there examples of where that's taking place and like what is the trend that we're seeing? Because I could imagine like it might be like hard to implement. I lived in San Francisco for a little bit, and you would think that would be like a predominant place, but it was always hard when you get to work of where to put the scooter or bike. So I'm just curious how you see that movement taking off.
Well, I mean, that's one form of Robin Hood parking or for Robin Hood planning, right? Replacing some of the parking spaces for cars along roads, replacing them with parking, but for micromobility modes. I'd be perfectly okay with that because, I mean, you've seen those bike parking racks that are even shaped like a car, so that they have the silhouette of the car. So then you can clearly see if you put 10 bikes parked in there, they take as much space as a car, right? So yeah, that would be okay. I do want to say though, I mean, I lived in the Netherlands, been yeah, more than 10 years ago now. That's where I did my postdoc. And so that's a country where people cycle a lot. And I must say that bike parking can also turn into a blight. If, I mean, in Dutch cities, you often see these stations with parked bikes on top of one another. People just drop them off and then go off to the train to get to work because a lot of people don't work in the same city they live in. So they use a bike to reach stations. So bike parking does need some regulation as well. So it doesn't turn into blight, just like car parking. And
Thanks
I
for
see
that.
Paul has his hand up.
Oh, I can't actually see it. I must be missing it. Oh, there is. I've clearly clicked something. Sorry about that. So yes, by all means, go to the next person. Sorry.
Hi, Paul. Um,
Yes,
do you
hi,
want to read
Dorina.
your question? I read it on the chat, but maybe do you want to read it
Right, yes.
aloud?
But basically, I have two questions. The first one is the one in the chat, which is, yeah, in the process of compiling those chapters for the book, including mine from Singapore, um, what surprised you most, or what do you think might be most interesting to share with the audience of, mostly perhaps we're from Western countries, but there are some interesting varieties around the world. So that's the first question. But the second one is perhaps a bigger question, difficult one, about the process of change. And when we're thinking about changing a big planning and market phenomenon like cities and parking within cities, um, how do you see the sort of tension or the how do you see the role of, say, prices and markets versus planning and politics? That's three things really, I guess. The interaction between those three sort of ways that we make decisions in society. you mentioned both the politics and the planning, but you didn't mention anything about prices and markets. Do you want to reflect on that a little bit, perhaps?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I saw your question in the chat before, and that got me thinking. And perhaps one policy that I found striking was coming from Japan.
Right.
I did pay attention to that because Japan has these hyper-dense cities. They don't match the density of Australian cities, but they do, I wouldn't say match, but they do have some similar characteristics to cities in Europe, right? With high residential densities, high commercial densities, compact development. That's where I'm from, so I saw the similarities. So in Japan, some cities were saying that you simply cannot purchase a car until you can show that you actually have a place to put it at night. Instead of just dumping it on a public street all night long, you need to have access to some kind of private garage. And I really like that idea, actually. I thought that that's brilliant to limit further automobility in society. Now, in Australia, that wouldn't necessarily work because we already have a car-saturated society. So our car ownership is almost 90% now. So how much would that limit? It wouldn't limit much more automobiles. Like whoever could afford a car already got one, or whoever really wanted to drive already got a car. But that would help in countries like mine, for example, Albania, where maybe only half the people have cars. It's still automobility has still not completely taken hold. So these kind of policies preventative policies could be good in that sort of context, or in other, less developed context where not everyone has a car yet. So that would be a way to limit access. So I like that. And then you talked about the balance between market and planning. So as a planner, of course, I focused a bit more on regulations, but a lot of people have see the role of prices as being the most effective. And one of those people is Donald Shoup himself. Actually, I believe he trained as an economist before he became an academic in a planning school. So I understand that perspective as well, looking at prices. And he's been a big proponent of this idea of dynamic parking prices on street dynamic prices, meaning that the price goes up in real time as demand changes, right? So in hours of the day, like peak hours, which could be maybe around lunchtime when people go and do more shopping, so the price can shoot up, and then it lowers down during downtimes, and that kind of approach is good in the sense that it ensures that there is always some spots available on the street. There isn't the overcrowding of on-street parking. And you may ask, well, if people can't afford parking because of the manner responsive parking, then what do? Well, the idea is to also stir some people away from on-street parking towards off-street parking, cheaper off-street parking nearby. So making people park in some lot or garage that's maybe a 5-minute walk rather than try and park at the shop, right in front of the shop they want to go to, which is okay. Unless you have a physical disability and you can't walk that long, that should be okay for most people. So yes, I definitely agree. Yeah, pricing, economic tools also have a role to play.
So Daniel has asked another question and says, how does that Japanese policy work for renters who may have access to parking owned by their landlord when they purchase a car, but then they move elsewhere? Does it incentivize the oversupply of off-street parking at apartment buildings?
Yeah, that's a good question. It might just do that. I'm not sure how they've resolved this in Japan, because that's the thing about parking policy as with anything in planning, right? There might be unexpected completely unexpected effects. So you need to follow through the logic. Like, okay, but this seems like a good idea in theory, but what if people are renters? What if eventually they become owners, etc.? So, well, let me ask you, Daniel, do you think you might do that?
Um, yeah, I mean, that was my intuition was that it might have that
Mm.
effect. I don't.
Perhaps could I jump in, mate?
Curious, and I'm not trying to monopolize too much of the time here either, Paul. It sounds like you may have an answer to that.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. It may do that to some very small extent, but even homeowners often don't have on-site parking in the older parts of Japanese cities, right? The plot sizes are really small, so even single-family homes are on tiny little plots, no room for a car. And so quite a big percentage of people in Japanese cities are actually parking in leased parking in the neighborhood. So there's a market for parking, even in residential areas in most Japanese cities. And so that kind of like is a safety valve. And so there's no expectation of having parking on site in
It's
Japanese
actually
cities.
unbundled from the property in a lot of cases.
In a lot of cases, yeah.
Huh. Thank you for that.
So, Maya Yagod, I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if not. Asked, how do you deal with people who say that international precedences are good for those cities, but our city is different?
That's a very good question. That's a really, really good question. And I mean, it's the question in planning. We see that kind of pushback from communities all the time here in Australia as well. And I've done some work myself around international policy transfer, how places learn from one another or fail to learn. And that's one of the things that I found that examples need to be provided from places that are either culturally similar or have a similar physical structure, right? Like I talked before about this parking policy in Japan potentially being good for Albania. And the countries have completely different cultures, right? Mediterranean versus East Asian. But because the cities are high density, that's where I see that policy could work well, could be transferred from one place to the other. Another thing I found in my policy transfer research is that countries do tend to want to borrow from places they look up to. That's unfortunate, right? Because often countries are better off if they learn from places at a similar level of economic development. But that's the reality of the human condition. I mean, we live in an unequal world. Some countries are seen as more advanced, some countries are seen so as leaders, some are seen as laggards. And the perceived laggards, they tend to look at leaders. So it seems to me that policy ideas will have more traction if they flow in that sort of direction. And traditionally in the world, leaders used to be Western countries, partly as legacy of colonialism. But what we're seeing now is that there are other parts of the world, like East Asia, has risen so much, has become so much more prosperous. So countries in Eastern Asia now, Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they're starting to act as role models for other countries less developed. So it's important to look in the right places, is what I'm trying to say. Provide examples from places that people might be willing to look at, might be open to look at.
So is there anybody else have a question? Because I've got some questions here that I thought were really good, that I would really appreciate asking. One of them is actually, because you've got the feminist background, I wondered how you see parking through a feminist lens, because there's so much of transport that is gendered, which surprised me when I started this. And so to have my eyes open, so I'd be really curious to know whether you see parking as a gendered issue in any way.
I certainly do. I mean, here in Australia, we have broken even in terms of car use men and women using cars a while back. In fact, now there are some indications that women might even be more car oriented than men because they have all the family responsibilities, the kid drop-offs and the shopping, etc. And those things in our context, so suburban, so sprawling, cannot be accommodated without a car. But there are many other countries out there where women drive a whole lot less than men. Like my own country, Albania, is one of those, for example, and there are so many other examples around the world. So when you look at all this parking around our cities, you have to think, who is this serving? Is this serving women? And in a lot of cases, the answer is it's only partially serving women, but it's mostly serving men, younger men at that, or wealthier older men. So yes, there is a gendered critique of parking as well that could be made.
So just if I may ask another question about that. So in what way is parking gendered? Because is it to do with the land use? Is it to do with car dependence? Is it to do with, in what way is
Car
parking
dependence.
specifically
Car
associated?
dependence. Car dependence. So if cars are mostly being used by men, so then we're allocating all this land to accommodate the parked cars of those men. So it means the city is not serving the needs of good chunks of its population. It's giving a disproportionate amount of space to some population groups, and that's unfair.
For sure. I mean, the way that it's funded is entirely so focused on cars. So absolutely. So what were there parking initiatives in any of the cities in that book, in your studies, that have taken you by surprise?
Yeah, we talked about that a bit before, right? When we were talking about the policies in Japan. Yeah, is that the question?
I was just wondering if there were any others that you had seen that were quite novel and quite different in any other context. The Japan one is quite well known. I was just wondering if there were other policies that you had seen, maybe in terms of reform that you had seen.
Parking reform. Well, one thing that I see as promising is this idea of trying to gradually eliminate on-street parking so that roads are sort of freer of parking space, and try and put all the parked cars in off-street parking. And that comes with drawbacks, of course, because then more space needs to be devoted to off-street parking, and it costs quite a lot of money to build multi-story parking structures. Or if we go underground, that's even more expensive. But at least visually, that's quite an improvement for cities. And I can see some European cities do that, especially if they have a lot of bike lanes on surface roads. Then often bike lanes are in conflict with parking. It's difficult to design a bike lane. So if you put it next to parking, then you've put so the classic design is you have the sidewalk parking lane, bike lane, right? But that sort of design interferes with cyclists, because every time drivers need to get out of the parking lane, they're going to have to cut through the cycling lane. And cyclists are always put in harm's way because they're in the door opening lane, right? That's that kind of design of cycling path is known as the door opening lane. So often we see these accidents with drivers opening their doors and smashing cyclists, especially if the cycling lane is not wide enough. But then if you put the cycling lane between the parking lane and the sidewalk, I mean, that in theory offers a bit of protection to cyclists, as they're not right next to moving traffic. But even with that design, there has been some research saying that because it sort of limits visibility at intersections, that can also cause accidents. So either way, it's not great. Parking and cycling, combining them on the road is not great. So it's good to just not have parking at all. If you're going to do cycling lane, micromobility lane, good to clear the road of parked vehicles.
I think we're coming up to the end, but we've got enough time for another question. Thomas Tupero asked, are there any major cities or countries that have wrangled the parking issues to an extent that induced demand for car spaces, roads or parking is not an issue?
So you mean, Thomas, do you mean, are there places that have solved the parking problem? Is that the core of your question?
Yes, that is.
Well, I don't think we have. I don't think there are any cities that have completely resolved their parking issue. It's every city is still working on it. In fact, they haven't even been working on it for that long, because for the longest time this was almost a neglected area. It wasn't clear to people, is this land use? Should the land use planners worry about this, or is this transport? Should transport planners worry about this? So it sort of fallen, the parking aspect has sort of fallen through the cracks. So it's only in the last, I mean, since Shoup popularized parking as a problem, that cities are seriously thinking about this. So I wouldn't say there are any great examples there that have resolved the problem.
Which was just, sorry, you go.
If I could just follow up on that. I tied induced demand with parking issues and parking reform. Is that a legitimate tie together? Are they related in such a way that one can have an effect on the other?
Yeah. I think the traditional paradigm, predict and provide, what I talked about in the very beginning, there was a recipe for disaster. It's simply added to induce. It induced demand for cars. That's what it did, because it promised everyone that there would be a parking space available for them at their destination, and oftentimes that parking space would even be free, say around the shopping mall. I mean, not on the street. Generally, on street parking, there is some charge if it's a high demand area, main street and such CBD. But oftentimes, yeah, parking around suburban shopping malls was free, and around suburban office spaces as well, suburban office buildings. So yeah, it definitely induced people to drive more.
So
And
I've
I mean,
got a question. Sorry, you go.
Well, I was just going to add, I mean, there have been some examples of employers, even in sort of more suburban locations, offering people incentives to not drive and therefore not take up a space in the company's parking lot by offering them, financial incentives, like we'll give you a bit of money, or we'll cover your bus or train fare if you're willing to not drive and free up a bit of parking space. And those have tended to work, actually. People do take up those incentives.
Yes, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I have got a question which was just asked to me. It's not on the chat. It says, there was another question from Paul, read the process of change in cities. It's from Mark Watson. I know it's a big question, but can Dorina reflect on the importance of parking policy as cities develop? For instance, from initial low densities, like we have here in Caboolture in suburban areas, to planned higher density urban centres, which is certainly what's happening here in this area.
I mean, I think parking is an important it's an important element in that mix. And what I think we need to do is, again, we shouldn't think of parking as some sort of silver bullet, right? Because planning doesn't work that way. There are no silver bullets. If you want to solve the housing problem, there are like 10, 20 policy approaches we need to take. If we want to solve the transport problem, same thing. And it's the same for parking. And parking, like all other aspects of planning, needs to work in concert. Parking policy needs to work in concert with housing and transport policy. What do I mean by that in concrete terms? if a new development is proposed in a suburb or an inner city area or wherever, immediately, as soon as that's approved, planners need to think this is as good as done, right? The moment it's approved. So now we need to make sure that we provide public transport to serve this development rather than assume that everybody is going to drive as before. That's if the intention is to densify existing suburbs, right? So if you have, say, a conventional Australian suburb, low density, single family homes, suddenly you add, say, a mid-rise apartment building, 4 or 5 stories, more compact, say 50 to 60 units. Then you need to make sure you add to the service frequency of local bus lines, or maybe even add the bus line. And people act like, oh, but it's expensive providing transit, etc. And yes, it's expensive. It might be a bit expensive, but in the end, it's not that expensive. I mean, what does it take to add a bus line? Come on, it's Australia. We're not that poor. We can't add a bus line in a suburb. So that needs to happen immediately as soon as the development is approved, rather than build the housing, have everyone get sort of accustomed to their driving patterns, and then provide transit later when people are like, well, we're used to driving, we're not going to take the bus, right? You need to get people used to different mobility patterns. Right?
I don't know if it's just me. Has anybody else had Dorina cut out there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That's a pity. So, given Dorina's frozen on sea and we're coming up to the time anyway, I'm not sure, perhaps it is the right time for Paula. Would you like to make any announcements?
Paula, are you there? I know your internet was questionable.
I think I'm good, but
All right.
yeah, internet is playing tricks on everyone today, apparently. So I'm sorry for that. But well, yeah, let's see if Dorina can come back. If not, oh, there's my cat. If not, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Yeah, we're almost in the time, so we'll send Dorina all the questions that we have left in the chat. But really, we appreciate everyone's time, and thanks so much for joining us. I encourage you to keep. Oh, there's Dorina! Yay, Dorina! Would you like to say some last words? We're just wrapping and celebrating this all the insights and all the discussion that just arose after this conversation. So yeah. I think you're muted, Dorina.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions and the great discussion. I'd like to keep this trend of research alive because I see it as very important and connected to so many other planning aspects.